Hello. Welcome to the last panel of a fantastic conference, I have to say. I think we all agree we've had really rich and sometimes fascinating discussions over the past couple of days. So this is a great opportunity to have this panel to close as a closing panel, because we have 3 European sitting presidents and one of the best political journalists from Washington, D.C., to discuss more or less what we have been discussing over the past few days, but with a different perspective. So, I don't think any of you need any introduction, so we'll jump right into the discussions. I will just point out one thing, which is that today is a very important day for Europe and for NATO, because we have 2 big elections in the European Union. It's been mentioned that we have the presidential election in Romania, but also in Poland. And I think those 2 presidential elections illustrate very well the internal and external dynamics that are challenging Europe today, because I don't have to tell you, you all know very well the details, but of course if Georges Simeon wins tonight, the consequences will be quite important for all of us. And if Karol Nawrocki wins in 2 weeks' time, the second round, it will also be very important. So I think this is, if you connect the dots, you also know that Simeon went to Warsaw to support Nawrocki, and he also went to Washington, where he visited some members of Congress and leaders of the MAGA movement. So this is one of the few things that we are going to have to deal with. And maybe since we're talking about Washington, Susan, I'll start with you. What role does President Trump have in all this? And what is your sense of where he's taking the transatlantic relationship to?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Sylvie. And I'm looking forward to hearing all the presidents. So I guess I should start with an apology. You asked the question about President Trump, and I'm reminded of the fact of a conversation I had a few years ago with Stubb Talbot, who many of you know, one of America's great Russia hands, a former Deputy Secretary of State. And this was at the very beginning of Trump's first term in Washington. And I happened to go visit him at the Brookings Institution. He said, well, the person who was here right before you was the national security advisor of one of our allies from Asia. And he said, well, why are you here in Washington? And he said, well, I'm going to be coming to visit you a lot because Washington is now the epicenter of instability in the world. So here we are 8 years later, and I would say, if anything, that comment is even more true today. And so, of course, that's the reason that we're having a conversation. But I wanted to speak a little bit to the title of our panel today, Allies, Enemies, and Interests, because I think there is a difference in Washington from 8 years, even if lack of predictability or instability is a through line. Clearly, President Trump in his second term is perhaps a more distilled version of himself. His views haven't necessarily changed at all, but I think you're seeing a level of actions that go along with it that suggests someone who's very much unconstrained. And I just wanted to start us off with a quote today that speaks to this question of who is the enemy and who is the ally right now. And you might not have noticed this, but right before the 2024 election, Trump gave an interview to Fox News, and he said something he said versions of before, but I don't think it got enough attention. And he said, we have 2 enemies today. We have the outside enemy, and we have the enemy within. Mm-hmm. And the enemy from within us, in my opinion, is more dangerous than China, Russia, and all these countries. And I would just follow that up because it's a pretty extraordinary thing for the President of the United States to say, and we can all see the actions that have actually flowed from that over the first few months of this second term. But I would note that last week was President Trump's first major trip overseas since becoming president again. And he gave a speech in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, very similar in some respects to the speech that he gave 8 years ago on his first foreign trip when he also went to Saudi Arabia. And he said, I won't lecture you anymore. America is not here to talk to you anymore about human rights. The difference this time is that he also spoke about the enemy within. And I found it really remarkable for our conversation today that the President of the United States went to Saudi Arabia and he said, I won't talk to you about human rights, but he also blamed America's nation builders and interventionists and, in effect, globalists for what they had done. So even when he's overseas now, the President of the United States is speaking in many respects about the enemy within. Mm-hmm. So I'll leave it at that to start us off.
Thank you very much. And you've covered several presidents in the White House. Did you expect this one, who was already a president, did you expect him to go that far this time?
Well, I spent some of the time in the first couple years after President Trump left office in 2021 writing a book about his first term and interviewed about 300 people after they left office. And the message that I heard very clearly, including from the most senior officials who had worked in Trump's first term on national security, was that if he does come back to power, this will be different. Because the big lesson Trump and his advisors learned was about those who would surround him, and that the next time they were not going to have people who were going to constrain him, who wouldn't be loyalists. And I'll leave you with a quick anecdote from a very senior national security, nonpartisan person who spent a lot of time with Trump in the Oval Office in his first term. And this person said, well, you remember the movie Jurassic Park? If Trump comes back to office, I believe that he'll be like the velociraptors in Jurassic Park. In the first movie when the children run into the kitchen and they think they're safe and they're hiding and that they've locked the door, and then they hear click, the handle turns, and the velociraptors have learned how to open the door. And I know it's a very kind of chilling scene, but specifically, the idea was the velociraptors have learned the key to running the big executive branch in the United States. It's about the staff. It's about who's surrounding you. And I think that's the difference between Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0.
Well, after the porcupine, I think this gives you an idea of the kind of environment we have to act in now. President Karis, first, thank you very much for hosting us again here in Tallinn. You came to office in October 21, and so that was before the full-scale invasion, that was before the return of Donald Trump to the White House. You are president of a country which has seen many changes in its history. How does this compare to what your country has been through before?
Well, first of all, thank you all the participants coming to this conference, especially presidents. One came directly from Africa, and so I'm very pleased that we are all here. Yesterday, our chief of commanders said that in war there is no price for a run-up. It's different when we talk about Eurovision. We got a third prize yesterday, so congratulations for Estonian team and singers, and of course Austria was number one, neutral country by the way, and so doesn't mean anything, I don't know, but yes, our history has been quite interesting in a way, and what we learned from our history is never alone again, and this is our lesson what we try to repeat ourselves. And we understand that history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes, and we learn to listen closely to the echoes of history and avoid replaying the discordant notes of the past. And when we gained our independence in 1918, 1920, we were not alone. We had allies. One of us, British Navy here, was supporting us. Brits are here again years later. But we lost our independence in our resistance against the Soviet Union because we were alone. No friends, no allies, because Europe was busy before the Second World War to solve their own country's problems. And we lost our independence. And that means having allies and sticking together is, that ensures our independence and freedom also in 21st century. And it's more even true now in these turbulent times we face today. Russia's aggression in Ukraine, which I've been talking all these 3 days, but also heating up the Middle East, the frozen conflicts in Kashmir, Sudan, and so forth. So it's a long list. We can have it here. Seems like hell is empty and all the devils are here on earth. So that means we have to respond and to be effective. We need unity, clarity, and message, and of course dedicated leadership. And yesterday there was a discussion on different topics, and one word I heard was about how money we have in Europe compared to Russia, compared to US, what's the budget, comparison of population, and so forth. But there's also one word, willingness. That means if you don't have willingness, it doesn't really matter how much money do you have and how big is your population. And that's why it's important to put resources on defense in Europe. What we can do as a small country, just to give an example and lead by example, but others have to do the same. I mean, being a member of an alliance, it's not being a member of a tennis club. That you pay your fee, and even if you don't pay a fee, you still want to get benefits. That means you have to put resources on NATO and alliances as well. So as I said, and said so many times here in this conference, that Estonia puts 5% from next year. I know that some countries have difficulties, but I guess we should work on it. And I really, very appropriate questions from my predecessor, President Ilves, yesterday. What about the drug report? Because if our economy doesn't work, if we are not competitive, we don't have money to put resources on defense either. So that's a very important question, and it has to implement these ideas which are in this drug report. The second willingness is willingness to protect our countries. And I'm pleased to say that Finland and Estonia, I mean, last year it was 80% or over 80% of people are willing to defend their own country. Mm-hmm. So that's also important. It's not in every country in Europe. And third one is stand up for allies. So Estonia has been in different missions in Afghanistan, also in Central Africa, Mali, and Middle East, and so forth. We have supported also Polish and the Lithuanians on this migration, forced migration attempt a couple of years ago. So this is also important to stand up if we're talking about interests. And of course, finally, I mean, we know who our immediate enemy is. It's next door. And being a genetist and a molecular biologist, I know something about genes. And this aggression gene does not disappear. And we cannot remove or alter the gene. What we can do is to silence or inactivate the genes. So this is what we should do, to inactivate this aggression. And this is what helps is with our military might and our deterrence. This is our solution for that silencing the aggression gene of our neighbor. But I'll stop here. So,
well, there's a lot already in your remarks, so we can come back to this in the discussion. President Pirc, Musar, You are a lawyer by training.
Correct.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, some people say.
Well, and you are witnessing the international legal system collapsing.
Yep.
The UN system of collective security, the international norms, the system of international norms. Do you think it's beyond repair? Can it be fixed?
The answer is simple. It has to be fixed. Because without the international law, the world is going already in front of our eyes into a chaos. And what bothers me the most is that people who are ruining the international order are not offering any new suggestions. So if you are not offering any new suggestions, then I don't have... How can I say, do they want the chaos and then just to see what happens? Is this an experiment, what they are doing? Of course, as a lawyer, it hurts my legal soul to see what's going on. And this is why I really am following, what's going on. And just to go a bit into a history, I have to tell you, I am a believer in international law. I am a European Union believer. This is who I am, because I believe in the rule of law and, in respecting human rights. But if we go into the history, United Nations were established after the Second World War, and the P5 countries with the permanent seat and veto powers are the countries who were the winners of the Second World War. Who would have thought that one country out of those 5 who are the most responsible for the peace and security on this planet would violate the UN Charter? Of course, we know it's Russia. Russia is the aggressor. And that hurts me. But what do I see today? I am a staunch supporter of the reform of United Nations, because veto powers there are absolute veto powers, and United Nations are non-operative, if I may say.
Paralyzed, yeah.
Paralyzed. And this is why I think, despite the fact that deep down in my soul, I do know that it looks like mission impossible today to reform the veto powers, because all the P5 countries would have to say yes. But do we have to stop talking about it? No, I never do that. My modus operandi, being a president, is if you're quiet, nothing will happen. But if you do speak about the problematic topics, if you are vocal about that, then you give this topic a possibility that something is going to change. And to reform the UN Charter, I think that the veto powers are the most important points of the UN Charter to be reformed. For example, China is pragmatic in using veto. Russia and United States, sorry guys to say, they both have blood on their hands when they use a veto when we discuss mass atrocities and genocides. France and United Kingdom didn't use the veto power since 1986, not a single time after that. But we have to start discussing this. Pure legal hygiene is that the country who's on the table of Security Council would not have the right to vote. Don't vote about yourself. And I would prohibit veto when we discuss mass atrocities and genocide. So that's the future. We have to start debating this. And in all democratic countries where you do know the veto powers, it's not an absolute power, it's a relative power. Another body has to decide if somebody uses veto. So that's my legal soul is speaking. I don't know, maybe I am naive, I am new into politics. You have to know a bit of my background. I was a human rights lawyer. I'm in politics for 2.5 years. I was never a member of any political party, nor am I today, so that's who I am. That's my spirit, my soul. And what I see today in the international arena, in international politics, is the lack of trust. Total lack of trust. And a lot of hypocrisy. If I may just say one more sentence, madam. If we are really vocal about what Russia is doing, being an aggressor, violating the UN Charter, are we so loud and clear in other conflicts around this planet? I'm pretty sure you do know there are currently 69 armed conflicts around the globe, which is the highest number after the Second World War. Is that what we want? To be quiet? And also, United States of America are the allies of European Union, also of Slovenia. But are we honest enough to President Trump to say to him, sorry, this is not the right path you are taking? How many people do you see, how many presidents, prime ministers do you hear being vocal about Trump's aspirations for Greenland, for Panama, for Canada? I know that we are allies, but we have to be honest to each other. That's what I want to see. Sorry, I hope.
No, you're being very honest. Yeah. Thank you very much. And before I turn to President Stubb,
may I have a quick comment? I mean, with UN issue. I mean, if UN was working properly, we wouldn't have sitting here discussing these issues, because this is an international peacekeeping organization. And one example, Finland is sitting next to me. In October 1939, Soviet Union invaded Finland, and Soviet Union was expelled from League of Nations, which was also a predecessor of United Nations. So it did happen. It worked. Although, I mean, this leak didn't work. I mean, it's dissolved as well. But anyway, but it's a good example.
Absolutely. President Stubb, President Pirc Musar just said, who is honest enough to say to President Trump what you're doing is wrong? So you had the opportunity to do that. For 7 hours, I understand, while playing golf. By the way, did he cheat? No? But more seriously, you had serious conversations with him. So what can you tell us about?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for those easy questions to start off. Really nice to be here, and to all of my Estonian friends, just to pay my respects, you should know that the first thing I did when I landed at the airport was to have an espresso macchiato. And for those who don't understand regional politics, this was, according to our intelligence services, the first time NB8, all countries, Nordic and Baltic, were in the final, and immediately Estonia shows.
And Slovenia didn't qualify for the final, so what can I say?
It's a great privilege to be, I mean, at the Lennart Meri conference. For me, Lennart Meri is very much the Martti Ahtisaari of Estonia, you know, one of the greatest statesmen that we have had. And I sometimes wonder, you know, what Lennart Meri or Martti Ahtisaari would be thinking about the situation where we are. My first observation is to say that quite often in panels you have rather wishy-washy titles, right? You know, we have these long conferences, but I think this one hits, you know, is pitch perfect. It is missing one word. I think we should have allies, enemies, values, and interests.
Absolutely.
And that's what it's all about right now. Yeah. So what's my thinking? Or Finland's thinking at the moment? I think our starting point is always deal with foreign policy as it is, not as you would wish it to be. So it's a pretty realistic sort of analysis. And our analysis is that we are in the phase of a change in the world order, very similar to what Alar referred to, you know, the post-World War I League of Nations, post-World War II United Nations, and post-Cold War, well, end of history thesis. Now we're witnessing a similar moment, which, you know, seems to happen every few decades. And in my mind, it started on the 24th of February 2022. Yes, I know we could go back to 9/11, we could go back to Russia's attack on Georgia, we could go back to the annexation of Crimea, but I do think that was the starting point. And now we're in a situation where we have to be honest with ourselves. This change is being accelerated by a new US administration and Donald Trump. And then you have to ask yourself, okay, you know, how do you deal with this change? First, you realize that a change is taking place. And secondly, you try to impact things where you can. And I think really the big game in the world order right now is between a multipolar conflictual disorder. Right? I'm just back from East Africa. I look at Sudan, South Sudan, Burundi, DRC, Congo, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and so on and so forth. And of course, we are focused mostly on Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine and on Israel, Palestine. So that is one option. The second option in my mind is a multilateral, cooperative world order. And here's where we come, Nataša, to your point. How do we get there? How do we convince the Americans and the rest of the world to stay true to essentially the global institutions that we created after World War II, in many ways, I'd argue, in the image of the West? The UN, the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank. Well, I think there are a few things we can do. One is to engage with the American administration and with Donald Trump. And as we all know, inside the administration, there are different types of views. I personally think that President Trump's worldview is not far from what we saw in the 1800s in the concert of states. So it's very much this sort of big power, sometimes conflict, but also cooperation. So his first administration was more about big power conflict. Now it's about possible big power cooperation. And if that's our analysis, we ask ourselves, okay, how can we perhaps convince to do different things? We have to have a conversation on tariffs and trade. To perhaps try to convince the American administration that it's better to have free trade and common rules than transactional deals. Second, we have to be serious, as Alar said, about our defense in Europe and show that we are security providers, not security consumers, because that is the reality in the thinking of President Trump right now. And I actually think he's right, on this particular one. By the way, may I just add a little footnote? I do sometimes get a little bit frustrated that we're so focused on percentage points. You don't fight wars with percentage points. You fight wars with capability. Capability gives you deterrence. So I look at the armies of Turkey, I look at the armies of Ukraine, I look at the armies of Poland, I look at the armies of Finland. There's a lot of capability there, very little, well, there's a lot of percentages as well. Just remember that I think Russia now spends 40% of its national budget on military, and it's somewhere between 6 to 10% of its GDP on defense expenditure, but it's all backed up with a capability. And the final point then is, how do you convince the US to be engaged in multilateral institutions? There, I actually think we have to go through the back door. I gave a speech in the UN General Assembly in September, and I kind of made the 3 points, Nataša, that you did. So number one, double the membership of the UN Security Council, include countries from Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Number two, remove the veto power. And number three, suspend voting rights of a country which is in blatant violation of the UN Charter. And how do we get there? It's probably not going to be now about convincing the United States, but it's going to be about convincing the Global South. Because the Global South is going to be the matchmaker here. It doesn't need to, nor does it want to choose between the Global East, say China, Russia, or the Global West, say the US and us. It has enough agency to make the decision for itself. So we need to convince the Global South that, please, guys, work on the UN institutions. Let's change the power balance in them. My final point on this, I don't know, but how many of you knew that Nairobi has the third biggest UN presence and institution in the world?
UNEP.
Yeah, and UN Women and Habitat and things like that. And this is the thing, we in the West, we just think UN is New York and Geneva. No, it's a hell of a lot more. So, we need to give the Global South agency in order to restructure the world order. My final point is that I think we're in this for somewhere between 5 to 10 years. And that's why I think it calls for some analysis and cool heads.
Absolutely. Thank you. Susan, I want to jump on what President Stubb just said about big power and the mentality that President Trump has, this 800 years, 1800. Does that coincide with what you see from in Washington? This the way he sees the world? Is that the way? And then I would like to ask the presidents if this is all about big powers. So how do you make Europe the big power? And does Europe want to be the big power? So Susan.
Yeah, I think it's an incredibly important point. For President Trump, one of the things that's been hardest for people perhaps to understand, because it's such a break with how the U.S. has approached the world, is that, really from the beginning of his time on the world stage, he has been essentially a consistent critic of America's allies and often praised America's adversaries in ways that are hard to make sense of. And I would say to be very cautious about the idea that there is a sort of foreign policy doctrine. There's lots of people who kind of layer their ideas onto President Trump. There are many people inside of his administration or in the MAGA movement who may have a specific ideology. Often they're at odds with each other, and therein perhaps is the space for diplomacy by President Stubb and others. But I would say that for President Trump, he may have a few places that he wants to go. Tariffs is something he's always wanted to do, but at the same time, since January 20th, the Washington Post found recently that there are 50 different global tariff policies that his administration has announced just in the last few months. So, you would be very hard-pressed to understand where we are on any given day, even if some of the general principles of where he wants to go to are outlined. And I do think this notion of America as a great power, himself as the leader of this nation, there are only a few people, I think, that he really sees as peers and equals on the stage, and essentially that's Russia and that's China. And I think it's important to recognize that. The notion of UN reform is not something that the President of the United States is going to take up. He is allergic to any kind of multilateralism, and that includes, to a large extent, NATO, by the way. Now, he may or may not follow through on his questions about NATO, but I believe that as a basic sort of, core view of his, he is not a believer in multilateral action of any kind.
Yeah.
Can I just, Susan, on that? I agree. Sometimes we try to find doctrine where there's no doctrine, and quite often in foreign policy, it's more about, instruments and interests than about values. And I think our analysis is that we are moving from this multilateral cooperation towards multipolar transaction. And then we have to ask ourselves, where do the transactions sit? I think innately the thinking of the Trump administration, correct me if I'm wrong, is that globalization and multilateralism is bad, but actually there are a few deals to be made in regional integration. And that's why, I know there is a lot of talk about, US, NATO, and so on. I mean, in all of the conversations that we have had with the US administration, not in one conversation has there been an indication that the United States is going to withdraw from NATO. And I do think, and I hope, of course, that things will be settled once we get the percentage issue done at the summit in Hague at the end of June. And once we, the Europeans, start taking more responsibility for our own defense, I do think it is in the strategic and vested interests of the United States to stay engaged in NATO and have allies there, because even if there's this concert of powers, the key to adversaries in this concert of powers are still Russia and China. One final point, what I try to hammer down in my conversations with the president is to explain that Russia is not anymore a big power. Certainly not economically. It is smaller than Italy, slightly larger than Spain. Militarily, it wanted to deny the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine 3 years ago, and here we are. It has advanced less than 1 percentage point this year. So, and its inflation rate, its interest rates over 20%, its reserves are out. So it's not a country which can be by definition, seen as a big power anymore. Mm-hmm. And these are the types of messages that you have to convey. It's not an easy game, but again, I come to the point that you just have to keep on engaging the American administration and respectfully try to bring your messages down. And at times, if you have good trust with the president and his people around him, hammer down a few points. I come from a small country. You can influence a few things, but it is still quite minimal.
You also have icebreakers, not only golf players, right?
There's a good transaction to be made there, yes. I have to admit.
President Pirc, you wanted to intervene?
Well, just a small comment. I mean, you mentioned so-called global south. I mean, it's also important as far as Russian narrative is concerned. I have been to several countries before presidency and during presidency. I mean, this sentiment towards Soviet Union is there for obvious reasons. I mean, we got educated, people got educated in Soviet Union, and also support from Soviet Union comes to African countries. But there's one important point. I mean, Ukraine was also part of the Soviet Union. Sure. That means Ukraine also supported African countries. But we shouldn't go there and just patronizing, but to really to try to explain and tell our narrative.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Absolutely. Last questions before I give you the floor to the audience so you can prepare your questions. Values was mentioned as the missing word in these titles. What do we do? I mean, our alliance, the Transatlantic Alliance, is supposed to be values-based. What do we do if the main partner turns against these values and becomes a kind of, elected authoritarian regime or illiberal democracy? I don't know, we can go down the list. What does it mean for our alliance? Or President von der Leyen said the other day that the West, as we knew it, doesn't exist anymore. I don't know if that's exactly what she had in mind, but these are questions that we've also been discussing here.
I don't want to lose my dream, for the values and the world where the dignity for all the people is at least in our mouth, in our words. It has to stay that. What's the solution? More golf. But not to take me wrong, Alex, I would love you to go and play hockey with President Putin. I mean, we have to open a dialogue with the enemy as well. You're smart enough. You are. And I envy you the knowledge that you do possess because you're long in politics. You know what's at stake. But what are we doing in European Union? Is anybody discussing the possible solution, not only because of Ukraine? Slovenia is a staunch supporter for Ukraine, don't get me wrong. But are we discussing the solutions with the enemy? No, we are not. Mm-hmm. And that's also the problem.
So we should talk to Russia as Europeans.
When I was at the peace conference in Switzerland a year and a half ago, Alex, I think you were not a president. We've met there for the first time. You were just elected. Yeah. I think I was the only one who said, what kind of a peace conference for Ukraine we have here in Switzerland without Russia being present? And I said also, China should be present. And what we are facing today, the peace talks started without Ukraine being present and without European Union being present. The security of Ukraine is the security of Europe. And the open dialogue is what we have to do. If we are going to turn to blocks again, we are on the edge of the Third World War, or the Cold War. My dear friend Alex, you know the Helsinki Final Act. In August, the 50th anniversary is going to be where Finland was the intermediator to show to the world that, the Cold War should be stopped, and it's possible for this war to be stopped. It took them 20 years to warm the relationship. And you asked, Madam, also about the power of European Union. I will just tell you a couple of numbers. Of course, European Union is the third strongest economy on the world. We are economically strong, but we are not politically strong, because we are in the lack of unity inside European Union as well. And as you said, Aris, you said, all the money on this planet for, defense budget raise is not going to help us if we are not going to be unified in European Union. And if we want to be politically strong, that's only unity can bring this strength. And I was just reading an analysis of Australian Institute for Strategy and Politics. They were analyzing the strength of countries regarding the critical infrastructure and digital technologies. 10 years ago, United States of America were leading in 60 fields of analyzed 64 fields. 10 years after, today, China is leading in 57 of them, and United States only in 7. European Union is neither on first or on second place in any of those. So that's what we are facing today. Of course, sometimes, students ask me when I give lectures in Slovenia, but what do you say about Hungary and Slovakia? And we see that there is no unity there. Do we discuss with Slovakia and Hungary enough to see what's the problem? To find, the common interest? And by the way, neither Slovakia nor Hungary, they don't want to go out of European Union. So they see pluses in this. Sure. Yeah, but they have to contribute. And then I say, it's really very hard, to work with 27 different nations in 24 different languages. But I rather have this kind of democracy where we do have problems than a dictatorship where allegedly there are no problems. But if you realize that, again, dialogue, dialogue, dialogue. If you're not successful the first time, go and try again. Second time, third time, and so on and so on. This is what I truly believe in.
Yeah. Thank you, President Karis. Dialogue with
I completely agree with this last point, that we should consider our friends enemies. That means we should talk to them. I mean, especially in European Union. We do have differences, that's for sure.
Sure.
But we should talk to them. And the same, I was asked about, is Trump our friend? I said, he's definitely not our enemy. So we have to keep our friends, and that's important. What I'm not sure about is about playing hockey with President Putin.
Maybe Alex is
because I've seen YouTube. I mean, 10 goals in a game, and this is what Putin does. So. I have my doubts.
We'll bring a European Union hockey team.
I mean, I guess the key question that you posed in the beginning was on values.
Yeah.
So in order to survive this transition of the world order, we in Finland, government and parliament, have defined our foreign policy instrument, not doctrine, but instruments, as values-based realism. So basically that means that on one hand, you're true to your values, freedom, democracy, human rights, fundamental rights, rule of law, equality, justice. But on the other hand, you're realistic that you cannot solve the world's big problems, such as climate change or conflicts, technology, migration, development, economy, with only like-minded countries. Otherwise, we just have the Baltics and the Nordics, sitting around and drinking tea and speaking niceties.
Power. Yeah.
Now, what we did in the beginning of my presidency was to sort of define 3 foreign policy areas that we try to focus on. Our number one focus is on Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine, because we feel that is existential. It serves both our values and our interests. The number 2 focus for us is our Euro-Atlantic relationship, which for us means EU, NATO, and our relationship with the United States. Now, when we define values-based realism, I didn't necessarily think that we would have to use this instrument, in our policy across the transatlantic. But now, as we can see, there are some issues that we disagree on, and then we try to work on them. I did think that the global south, and especially the global east, would be the area where we need values-based realism the most. Now, then, when it comes to playing golf or playing hockey or basically, reaching out to Russia. First of all, I think I'm quite nice on a golf course, but I'm quite violent in the ring. so I don't think it's a good idea. But more seriously, I think what we have decided, because remember that the leadership on the European side is now with what we call E3. So that's basically Macron, France, Starmer, the UK, and Merz, Germany. Then, of course, with strong flank support.
Some add Poland. Yes.
Strong flank support from Tusk in Poland, and then also, I think, from Meloni, at least, I hope. And then you have some smaller guys that, try to work in the back office and do things. But we did agree in our last meeting in Paris that if there were to be any contact with Putin, it would have to go coordinated and through E3. And I think that's probably the best way to do it, because I think Nataša is right in the sense that right now, of course, our connection with Russia is absent. So it's basically Trump and Witkoff talking to Russia and us, being nowhere on the stage. So I'm sure that there are some diplomatic channels that are and can be used, but on the top level, I think we should not go solo, with the connections.
There's one European talking to.
Sorry?
There's one European talking to Putin. It's Fico, President Fico.
Yeah, and then of course, Orban has been there as well. Again, I've said this before. We're going, and this is not only because it was study, but we are going towards a more flexible Europe. So basically, we're seeing what I would call an EU plus, which is kind of the UK, Norway, Iceland, Canada, EU minus, with Hungary and Slovakia. And I don't mean that as an offense, but if anyone goes to the victory parade in Moscow on the 9th of May. I mean, for me, that has got nothing to do with European values. Quite the contrary. I find it vulgar.
Thank you very much. I think this is very clear.
Can I just say something about the values?
Please, go ahead.
Sometimes I ask myself, how low can we go? Following what Antonio Guterres, as a Secretary General, is doing in United Nations, and he's a persona non grata in Israel. He's seen as a problem, but is he doing anything wrong? He's fighting for human rights. He's talking about the genocide in Palestine. He's fighting for women's rights. Did we really reach this level that a person who does that is a problem? This is, also kind of a problem for us, being quiet.
Okay. I have a question there. Yeah, Kadrilik, yeah. And then we'll take Stephen here and the gentleman here. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Kadri Liik. I am Russia expert with the European Council on Foreign Relations. And I would want to ask more about Europe and Russia. President Stubb, I was actually intrigued by your statement a little bit over a month ago. You said that Finland should mentally prepare to eventually restore relations with Russia after the war. And I would want to hear, what did you have in mind? I mean, to make it clear, I don't suspect you of being one of those politicians who suggests dialogue for the sake of dialogue, hoping it produces miracles. I think you had something much more realistic and interesting in mind, and I would want to hear more about it. And also, other presidents, how do you imagine, if you imagine at all, Europe's relationship with Russia after the war? I mean, Russia will be there, but what will be the relationship like? Will we talk? I mean, what about? To what end? What is our leverage? Especially given that, from Russia's point of view, and that's now my assessment, I think they view the European Union as their last remaining ideological enemy with our liberal value-based worldview, but we are a weak enemy. At the same time. So their willingness to engage with us on anything is pretty low, they would be rather more keen to crush us. So how do you picture the relationship? I mean, I myself struggle imagining it. Thank you.
Thank you. Stephen Erlanger.
Steve Erlanger with New York Times. You still haven't answered Alex whether Trump cheats at golf. He's reportedly a cheater at golf, but I'm sure he didn't with you.
We were on the same team. We won the tournament,
Apparently he won thanks to you.
and I would never cheat in golf.
Like a good ally, you shut your eyes.
Oh no,
No.
victory at all cost.
I want to go back to a point that Sylvie raised, which I think is important. I'm now in Germany. The Germans feel orphaned. I mean, their whole foreign policies was based on transatlantic connection, being embedded in the EU, but security based on the transatlantic NATO relationship. They were built by an American occupying army, who basically wrote their constitution, gave them their idea of what democracy should be like, and now they look at what's happening across the water and they feel orphaned. One German official said to me, in a way, Europe is what's left of the West. So I just want to press you a bit more on what it means even to your populations when you see the United States, which is supposed to be the leader of the alliance and so on, doing its own democratic backsliding, where its benign imperialism, which we in America, of course, call altruism, turns into MAGA.
Yeah.
Thank you. I will take a third question here.
God, I'm not going to remember these.
Thank you so much. Aziz Burkhanov from Kazakhstan. My question for the distinguished panel is building up on the topic of the global south, which was mentioned in the earlier remarks. So I was wondering if distinguished panelists could elaborate more in specific or practical terms, what would be the Europe's vision to reach out to more actively engage with the global south nations, many of which, for example, for various reasons, may not perceive Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine in the same way it is perceived in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Susan, maybe you want to answer the question, I mean, any question you want, particularly the Stephen's question about the West, and how do you see this from Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the answer is interesting for those whose, job now is to find the space to operate in a way with these real challenges of Russia, right? It's not an abstract conversation about values or the lack thereof. What's striking about President Trump is he's not going to use that language anymore. Although to his supporters, if you listen, for example, to Vice President J.D. Vance's speech, you could call it a lecture to Europe at the Munich Security Conference, you do hear a different set, you could say, of priorities or values that are being articulated. And so, my question for the group is kind of related to this, which is, in a very practical sense, what do you do with, does it matter at all that the United States is not there day to day? Can you get what you need in a practical sense, even if the rhetoric is not there? And I mean, I'm interested to hear, basically, you articulate the case that it is possible, even for someone who is skeptical of institutions, who is skeptical, frankly, of Ukraine. I mean, President Trump has a long history of essentially questioning whether this is an American value or priority.
Yeah.
So we have one more question now. And so relation with Russia, this question about the West and the Global South. So please, would you like to start and take whichever you want?
Yes, regarding the cooperation. Alex, I listened to your lecture at one of the Norwegian universities just recently, and I really liked what you said there. You were talking about 3 C's, 3-letter C. that we were in the period of conflict, now we are in the period of competition, but the future is in the period of cooperation. So this is what we have to work on. I know it's not easy. And I was really very saddened, again, as a lawyer, to see that Russia went out of the Council of Europe. So we cannot hold them accountable for violating human rights anymore. I was saddened to see, immediately after President Trump took office, that he stepped out of the Paris Agreement, out of the World Health Organization. They put sanctions on the International Criminal Court, which they helped to build. So international community should do whatever is needed so that more and more countries are going to be on those multilateral platforms, because this is the field and a platform for cooperation. This is what I want to see. And of course, when the war is over in Ukraine, and I really do hope it's going to end soon, we will have to cooperate with Russia. And they are one of the biggest countries on this planet. We might not be friends, but we have to talk to each other. That's what I would like to see.
Yeah, I mean, I'll try to remember the questions. I think the first one was about
Russia.
Russia. Here, I mean, just to put my answer in context at the time, on Wednesday we had Zelensky in Finland for a full day. On Thursday we're in Paris with the Coalition of the Willing. On Friday I flew to Miami to play around the golf with the president on Saturday. And then on Monday, I had a meeting with Keir Starmer in London. And I think, you know, when you're president, as opposed to, you know, as I was in the academic life, you don't have the luxury of sort of taking side steps in how you want the world to be. You have to live with the realities. And I think in Finland, and my countrymen, correct me if I'm wrong, for us, you know, the Cold War was quite traumatic because, you know, not only had we lost territory, but we also lost sovereignty and we lost voice. You know, we lost freedom of expression to say what we wanted about our foreign policy. I went back just 2 weeks ago when I was at the president's summer residence with a nice library of books of Finnish presidents. I went back to read, many of my compatriots will have read Tamminiemi, which was kind of the foreign policy legacy or doctrine, albeit shadow written by two personalities, to look at what Finnish foreign policy doctrine and lack of space to express was during the Cold War. And then, you know, fast forward to Russia's war of aggression and attack on Ukraine in February 2022. And even up until then, it was not kosher to be tough with your language on Russia. I mean, believe me, I got hit on that quite a few times. Charlie knows this. Gave a speech as a foreign minister when we had mediated a ceasefire in Georgia, which was called 080808. And I think I put forward 3 very inevitable truths about foreign policy.
You were just back from Georgia.
Exactly, which you wrote about in a really good book, which I, of course, commend. So, you know, and so put that into the context, and sorry for the long answer. What I'm trying to say is that we were in one extreme during the Cold War. We were toned down after the Cold War, and then we went to another extreme when the war began. All I'm trying to say is that geography will not change. And that means that at some stage, most probably when Putin is gone, there has to be some form of dialogue. But fortunately, that dialogue now takes place from a much broader context. In other words, us being not only members of the European Union, but also of NATO. I think what we fail to see right now in Europe is that the United States and its foreign policy doctrine is based on global competition, not on Ukraine and Russia. So we need to get out of the mindset that the US is only focused on Ukraine. It's not.
It's true.
Whether we like it or not, it is much broader than that. It is in the Middle East, it's in the Gulf, and many other places. So that's why I'm saying I'm trying to prepare for a time. I might not be president anymore at that time, so don't get me wrong, there's no span on this. And I understand that it did lead to some discussion here in Estonia as well, for the right reasons. But let's just remember that there is going to be a day when we have a ceasefire. There is going to be a day when there's a peace agreement. We will never, ever in our lifetime go back to how things were. There will be no Nord Stream 1. There will be no Nord Stream 2. There will be no Nord Stream 3. We're not going to go back to that. We learned our lesson. But we're going to have to mitigate and you know, come back a little bit on that. Then, if I may, and sorry again, you know, because if I don't answer Stephen, he's going to get cross with me. I give you two answers on. First of all, I don't know if you guys agree, but I have never seen the European Union more united than what we have been since February 2022. I mean, it's astonishing. I mean, I won't go into all the details of the sanctions package and financial instruments and defense and the rest of it. So that was kickoff number, well, there was kickoff number one was Brexit. Kickoff number two was COVID. But real tipping point was the war in Ukraine. And now that we're seeing not American disengagement, but a different type of a partnership with Europe, I think we're going to continue to go from strength to strength. Suddenly, regional integration actually looks pretty cool. You know, the things that the EU used to be scolded for, being slow, being bureaucratic, being inefficient, being stable. Hell, it's good to be boring nowadays, isn't it? So, you know, and Germany is a big part of this. I do think what was first announced as a Zeitenwende, which became a bit of a Zeitenslalom, I admit that. But now with Merz, you know, it's a fundamental change in German foreign policy doctrine. And I won't name any names, but I have been asked by American friends, aren't you worried? I said, no, I'm actually really happy. You know, the more military power Germany has, I think the better off we are in Europe. And I think just in this transition, when we become more responsible or autonomous in French terms, I think we just need to pay it step by step. And I'm quite happy the direction in which things are going. I mean, you know, there is always a silver lining in these kinds of situations. And one of them is responsibility taken by Europeans ourselves, and the other one is actually more agency and power to the global south. We're seeing a change in the world. Let's analyze it, and as I said, let's keep cool heads.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to think you're right on when you say there will never be Nord Stream 1 or Nord Stream 2 again, because apparently President Trump has other plans and Russia. So
I think we hold the power.
We'll have to talk to him again. Yeah. President Karis, please. Yeah.
Quite a number of questions, but I will start with a kind of rhetoric question. Why do we actually need COVID, and why do we need war in Ukraine? To be united. We shouldn't. I mean, we shouldn't have an enemy to be united. So, of course, it's an experience and a lesson we have learned now, but maybe next time we can be united without these kind of things. Second, about what's Finland. I mean, you are learning now yourself from your history during the Cold War, but we should also learn from your history, what happened during that time. And at the same time, I would like to defend Finland, because being a friendly partner to the Soviet Union, you built up a very good and efficient defense system back home. So when you joined NATO, I mean, everybody was in a way surprised. Yeah. So you are somehow managed to how to survive in these conditions. About Russia. It's probably a question of time frame. I mean, how long does it take after ceasefire or peace agreement? How long does it take to build up a trust? It might 10 years, maybe 20 years. But at the same time, we are talking about no business as usual. But we do know that there are European businesses waiting in Russia, just like foxes infected with rabies before the opening of English tunnel to go to England to infect these animals as well. So they are there. I mean, but of course you have to build the trust. Yes, there was a question about do we trust Trump? Again, it might take some time. I also had the opportunity to talk to Trump in Vatican under the sun on 2 hours next to Trump. And we talk about different things. And they also said, don't worry, you are safe. So can we trust? So the same with the Russians. This may be a bad comparison, but we talk to Germany. I mean, we started to talk, even built up Germany after the Second World War. So we have to be realistic in that sense. But of course, at the same time, we have to be very cautious. So this is how it goes. About Global South, yes, we have to be there. We have to talk to them. We have to collaborate with them. President of Botswana is coming to Estonia next week. I was in Botswana last year, so this is how it goes. The same with Kazakhstan. I'm going to visit Kazakhstan in, was it September or October? So
Me too. Should we go together?
Oh, let's go together.
I was there for a month ago. So.
I play tennis, you play golf. So, this is how it goes. We just to talk and collaborate, and that's the only way out of the situation.
Very good. Susan, you wanted to add something?
Just a brief point on Russia and this question of, whenever dialogue does resume between the European Union or individual European powers and Russia, and President Stubb said after President Putin is the likeliest. I guess the only point I would make is that President Trump has in fact made very clear his eagerness to resume not only a phone call that he's going to have tomorrow with President Putin, but he's eager to meet with him. I would say that he's eager to see U.S.-Russian relations, not just in the context of Ukraine, as you pointed out, but there's the very real possibility that President Trump will at some point in the relatively near future pursue some kind of renormalization of U.S.-Russian relations, and that's going to pose an immediate set of challenges for Europe to have answers for. I don't know what those answers will be, but I don't think that you can reasonably expect that this is something that you won't have to worry about in the short term. But in fact, the time to have the playbook for how Europe is going to respond should be soon, because I think that is the agenda, as I understand it, of President Trump.
Mm-hmm. First, President Pirc, Musar.
Yeah, just briefly regarding the Global South. Slovenia is currently a non-permanent member of the Security Council. This is why I follow, the work in UN so carefully. And there is a debate of enlargement of the Security Council. And of course, the Global South, as Alex said, they need to have seats because they feel, that they are not represented. They are excluded. So that's the fact. And what's going on in between before we are going to, solve this puzzle? Look at the numbers of the BRICS countries. There are 10 members, 17 in process, 22 in waiting room. All those countries have in the possession 45% of oil, 50% of natural gas, and 74% of raw rare earth materials. So that's what BRICS is all about. And again, in United Nations, we have to do something. There is one country, one vote. And we have to give a seat to the Global South countries in the Security Council. Again, a discussion about veto powers, of course. African Union, I'm going to visit Ethiopia at the end of May, is claiming if we need a permanent seat, but if we get a permanent seat, we need also a veto power. I am more in favor of what Alex said. Get rid of the veto power and see whether this works. We don't know, but I think it would have been better.
President Stubb and then
President one sort of smaller answer and then one bigger answer. I think, Susan, that perhaps a solution here, because I think your analysis is right. The U.S. is going to start doing deals with Russia when this is over. And that's why I think one of the preconditions for any kind of a peace agreement has to be the sequencing of the lifting of the sanctions, and we're going to have to work with the Americans together on that. I actually think right now that is the only language that Putin understands in any case. So I'm, carefully optimistic that Lindsey Graham and Blumenthal will put forward the sanctions package in the Senate hopefully next week. But we don't know. Depends on how the conversation goes between Putin and Trump on Monday. Now, my message has been to the American administration that if there is engagement on the top level, then that engagement has to be between Putin, Zelensky, and Trump, because you cannot talk over the head of the other one. On the business side, I actually think and at least hope that we in Europe are at the stage that any European company that starts doing business in Russia before things have been settled and there's a clear peace agreement and the sanctions have been, the public pressure is going to be so strong that it is not in their interest to go there. And on top of that, may I just once again stress the fact that the Russian economy is not going to grow. The Russian economy is very unlikely to modernize. So the business that you can do there is still just basically in raw materials and a few services. And then to come back just to the final, I guess, big point, my second point, had we had values there together with interest, I still think, no matter how much you talk about the BRICS, those are loose organizations without serious secretariats or institutional structures that are purely based on interest. And I think interests take you only so far. They last for as long as you don't have an interest there anymore. And therefore, I think that values-based organizations, such as the EU, whatever you think about, or such as NATO, they have a much more of a chance to last a longer time. And that's why I'm still very hopeful about where we are, even though the situation in world politics is rather
and OECD,
complex.
where Russia still is holding the seat, so it didn't went
OSCE,
out.
OSCE,
Sorry,
yeah.
OSCE.
Yeah.
President Karis.
Just want to make a small remark about this veto right in UN. I had a phone call quite recently with Antonio Gutierrez, and we talked about this reform as well. And he said, yes, we can do something about giving more power to General Assembly, but there is no any kind of consensus to reach, that there is no veto. Although, I mean, even now in the charter, it's written down that aggression shouldn't, vote or veto, but still, it's a reality, unfortunately.
I'm afraid maybe we have 1 minute left, so Charlie, we'll give it to the Finnish speaker. Yeah. No. Do we need yeah. And it will have to be very short, and the answer will have to be very short too.
Yes,
I agree with the values. We have to communicate our values within or between our societies. There are a number of actors who want to make this more difficult. We communicate through media, press, social media. There's American maybe interference, others. What would you like to see? How can we communicate our values better so that they're not as interfered with?
That's an easy question to finish with. So
Well, it takes another hour, probably.
in 30 seconds, please. Would you like to take it? No. So we see
maybe
that
I can tell.
go
in
ahead,
one
because
sentence.
it's about communication, and you.
Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Our lives will end the day when we become silent about the things that matter."
Very good.
That's it.
I agree.
Well, excellent.
Actually, the quote is, in the end, we will remember what the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends.
Correct.
Absolutely.
That's a correct quote.
You.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. That is a very good quote to end this session. I'm not sure we've solved the issue of the dialogue with Russia, but we've tried, yeah. So thank you very much, and please give a big round of applause to our president. Yeah.
Please remain seated. Dear presidents, your excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and dear colleagues. First of all, I want to say a huge thank you to our panel panelists, and a huge thank you for all of you for gathering here in very cold Tallinn. Just to sum up the conference very quickly, this year has been very unpredictable. It's not just the Americans, but as was just said, there's a lot of conflicts happening and the entire world is unpredictable. So putting together a conference has been very difficult. The themes keeps changing. just last week, I was thinking whether we should just quickly introduce a panel on India and Pakistan as one of the most biggest hotspots, but that then changed. And when I started thinking about what we should do this year's conference about, I very much wanted to focus on the cooperation between Russia and China and their other allies like North Korea and Iran, the so-called CRINC, and what do they want and how we, as the rest of the world, should respond to that. But, and whether they are an alliance, but it's clear that we actually have to speak about quite a bit about our own alliances as well. But I think the problem with Russia and China is that we can't separate them. They very much learn from one another and what they're doing, and sometimes it's what we do in context of them that they learn from as well. And I think Dima Adamski said very well last night when he said that the world has become a lot more nuclear curious thanks to the war in Ukraine. But what is the bigger problem is that they want to divide the world into spheres of influence, and they don't see Europe as one of those points of influence there or centers of influence there, and I think it's up to us to bring Europe there. And we can't afford to be divided in the collective West so that Europeans take care of Europe and Americans only take care of Asia, because the issues are interlinked and we all need to take care of it. And sometimes it seems to me that Russia and China are interested that we remain divided, whether it's within NATO and the EU or just as allies as well. So I think we're actually doing better. I think Europe is doing good in becoming a global power. I think we should have more faith in ourselves as well. Yesterday, the Chief of Defense of Estonia, General Meri, said really well that we're actually ready. We just need to believe that we're ready and act accordingly. This comes to what was just discussed as well, that we need to trust. And I think there's a lot that Europe has done. There's more we can learn, even to be a better ally to the United States. But we should also listen to the Americans when they say that they remain committed to NATO, so we shouldn't constantly question them. Ambassador Whitaker was here and said that the United States remain committed. So let's believe in them. Let us go forward together. And finally, I just want to say thank you to the entire to all of you for coming here, for making it happen, to my entire team at LMC team, to thank you. Let's continue the round of applause for all our wonderful volunteers who have made this all happen. To our wonderful sponsors, especially Helsing and DevSec Intel, to the hotel, to the RGB, and to everybody who's here. Thank you to Tommy Cash. There will be espresso macchiato downstairs, and go and have lunch. Thank you very much. Oh, and come back next year. The dates are May 15 to 17. Thank you.